Thank you. Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrea Woodside. I'm from RetailTrust. Might be of interest to note that the RetailTrust was founded in 1832, so 190 years ago. And whilst retail has changed hugely over the years, some of the challenges remain the same. And some of those challenges are around mental well-being, physical health, financial well-being, and just being well at work. My own story is I fell off the back of an Air Canada flight 31 years ago now, never made it back. And I've been a practicing clinical psychologist for 31 years, just about, working in workplace well-being with a particular focus on retail. So I think we can all agree that the last coming up to 2 years has been a bit of a ride, right? Okay. Well, one of the things that any major event causes to happen in the workplace, but particularly in retail, is something called the Titanic event. So, as you may recall, the Titanic went down in 1912, and she hit an iceberg. And she hit an iceberg just about 10 minutes to 11 at night. And here are dark, choppy seas. People are unable to get onto lifeboats. In fact, it was about 900 souls who were left in the water until the Carpathia, a sister ship, could come and collect them. And what was interesting about this is that of those 700 people, or 750, who actually made it on board the Carpathia and other ships, a lot of them survived. After 3 or 4 hours in freezing cold water, they kept going, and they kept going. But, and this was the interesting part, tragic, but interesting. And I'm sure you're thinking, how does the Titanic relate to retail? Well, I'll tell you in a minute. But a significant number of those human beings who had struggled for 4 hours to survive, once they reached the safety of the Carpathia, they died. Now, this isn't to bum everybody out, and I'm sorry it's not sort of a happy story, but I think what's interesting about this is that we've seen this back in 2003 during SARS. We've seen it during global recessions. We've seen it during civil unrest and massive political change. And we, of course, are seeing it during the pandemic. Now, what does the Titanic mean in the workplace? So if we think about what kept those people alive, that was fight or flight. So these guys were full, I mean full, of adrenaline and cortisol and about 700 other stress response hormones. And that allowed them to survive. But once they got to a place of safety, they had run out of physical resource. So it actually had very little to do with their psychology. It had much more to do with how their body was operating. Now, we might ask, how does this affect us in the workplace? Well, the reality is, and I think we know certainly, that retail has been under a huge amount of pressure, as much as the NHS. And it's my great wish for retail that people start to recognize its value and its importance in society. But whether people were furloughed or whether people were still working throughout all of those lockdowns, what they would have been experiencing is a high level of cortisol and adrenaline, and that was keeping them going. So I don't know if anybody can relate to this. If you've ever been through well, I'm talking to retailers, so of course the answer is yes. You've been through a really busy time, and you get this great time off at, I don't know, Christmas or long weekend, and you get sick. Does that ring a bell for anybody? Yeah. It's universal. And what's really interesting, too, is biochemically, we know that you will become sick within the first 72 hours of actually leaving the job. And we further know that everybody is different and every body is different. So actually, we all have our unique places where stress sits. The Titanic effect, therefore, relates to the phenomenon of when we stop, we're at greater risk of falling over than at any other time. So, I would ask, if we're looking at well-being in retail today and supporting yourselves and supporting your people, one of the most important things we can talk about, really, is leading from the front by caring for yourself first. It's like being on an airplane and the oxygen mask comes down. You put it on yourself first, right? So what we should be doing as leaders is supporting ourselves first and then supporting our people in a kind of ripple effect, but leave some energy over for yourself. And I would also say one of the best ways you can manage is to get good sleep and to get a good diet and to lay off drugs or cigarettes or alcohol or whatever people might be relying on during this very stressful time, okay? So it's about self-care, but it's also care for you. And the other thing I would say, and I think this is a really important point, that, we battle through, just like those guys that night from the Titanic, they were battling for their lives. And it's not too far a move to suggest that we've actually been doing the same for the last 2 years. So I would argue that the time where we're going to tip, okay, isn't necessarily right now, but it will come unless we're putting the self-care in, okay? So 31 years ago, I found it really hard to talk to employers about mental health. Not because I didn't love talking about mental health, or not because I didn't think it was important, but predominantly because nobody wanted to hear it. So think 31 years ago, right? And you talked about mental health, or you talked about distress, you talked about whatever it was, and people got scared. So we've kind of shifted, and I think that's a great thing. We've made a real shift in those last 31 years, and I would argue probably the last 5. Okay, and this predates COVID. But certainly the last 2 years, we've seen loads and loads of stuff in the press. We've heard lots of celebrities come out and talk about mental distress. We've heard lots of people in the workplace saying, I'm going to raise my hand, I'm not doing so well. And this is a good thing. This is a good thing. However, there's a word of caution. And the word of caution is that there is a big difference between having a mental health issue, a mental health condition, and going through a difficult life event. So you might have read about the tsunami of mental health problems, and it's all going to, come and, create havoc. We have no evidence to support that narrative. There is no evidence to support that narrative at all. We do not expect the epidemiological profile of mental health problems or disorders or conditions, whichever you like to call it. We have absolutely no evidence that the prevalence will change. Now, the prevalence amongst the standard population, and we call this lifetime prevalence, okay? So this means from the age of 18 until the day you die, you have a percentage chance of experiencing and developing and being diagnosed or meeting the diagnostic criteria for a mental health condition. In the general population, that's 1 in 4. In the working population, for those of us who are employed full-time, part-time, or in volunteering roles, that number changes to 1 in 7. But I would argue that a full 4 in 4 of us, not just 1 in 4, but full 4 in 4 of us, will have a difficult life event that they have to face at some point, okay? And we refer to these colloquially as the 3 Ds. So this might be death, might be divorce, or it might be debt. I would always caution managers and colleagues in the workplace to really refrain, literally just stop and step away when you have an urge to diagnose another human being with a mental health issue. That's incredibly important. Diagnostics is an art. It's actually not a science when you think about it. And it relies on science, and it relies on hard data. But it also requires people to think quite differently, because every single person is unique, and every journey on this planet is its own. So if we look at depression, depression carries us the largest mental health, what the WHO, the World Health Organization, calls burden. I don't really like that term, but we are where we are with that. The WHO says that it's the single greatest cause of disability in the world on any given day. Now, keep in mind, We're not wanting to say that 1 in 4 people have depression, because 1 in 4 people will experience a diagnosis of many different types, one or more of many different types of mental health conditions. I don't know whether you know this, but there's 19 different kinds of depression. There's 16 different kinds of anxiolytics, which are used to treat and reduce anxiety. There are 7 different types of bipolar disorder, 9 different kinds of schizophrenia, and there are 19 different kinds of personality disorders. In fact, what's interesting, when we think about, well, I've seen a sign that somebody's really not doing well, and they've been a bit tearful, and they've been a bit down, and they've been a bit low, they must have depression. That's an incredibly dangerous thing to do, because if you get it wrong and you convince them that they have XYZ, they could very well be missing a physical cause for their mood. Or it could be an underlying health condition of some kind, such as first stage of cirrhosis of the liver is anxiety. Who knew? 90% of women in the perimenopause, meaning before her menopause actually starts or her periods stop, 90% fall under the clinical diagnostic criteria for anxiety. And yet, not all of them have anxiety. There are 563 mental health conditions a human being can be diagnosed with. And I would argue, and what's really important here to remember, is that it is unusual for somebody to have one diagnosis at one time. So if we look at, for example, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and I think that's a really sadly misunderstood condition. OCD is something that can actually cripple one, and there is a higher than average rate of suicide for people who suffer. OCD is not just like liking your spice cupboards in a certain way. It might mean that with very severe OCD, it might take you 6 or 7 hours to get dressed in the morning. It might take you 12 hours to make a cup of tea. So OCD, it would stand to reason, would be accompanied by, more than likely, anxiety and depression. But then if we put something else into the mix, maybe they also are dealing with a personality disorder. So one of the best things we always say, whether it's a friend, family member, a colleague, your own manager, your own team, anybody, when supporting, it's incredibly important to signpost to the specialists. And I would also argue we've seen a real rise, we've seen an exponential rise in the NHS of self-diagnosis with mental health problems. And that's not surprising. That's not surprising, because we've written about it, and we've heard about it, and we've listened to it, and there have been lots and lots of articles and things in the press. What worries me about that greatly is that if somebody tries to treat their own mental health issue, that can actually be very dangerous. So, for example, with certain types of bipolarity, meaning one of the many kinds of bipolar disorder, it used to be called manic depression, we don't use that term now, taking certain herbal remedies can actually flare the symptoms and can pitch somebody into mania. And so what we think we're doing is good for ourselves, it's holistic, it's homeopathic, this is fantastic. We can actually, without the right guidance, be doing ourselves a great disservice. So one of the things about RetailTrust, and my colleague over here, Neil Duffy, so Neil is available to speak to you anytime if you're interested in our services. One of the things that we've done for the last 190 years, and certainly we continue to do this to this day, is to support people in a really safe, non-judgmental space for anything that's concerning them. And I think sometimes people think, oh, can I really reach out for help if I don't actually have a mental health condition? Of course you can. Because it's not about the 1 in 4, it's about the 4 in 4. There's two inevitabilities in this life, and one of them is you ain't gonna get out of here alive. Second bit of bad news is you ain't gonna get out of here in one piece. So the point is, we have to always rely on our support networks, our friends, our families, our colleagues, our people, and specialists such as your GP to actually access the right kind of support at the right time. Does it surprise you that there were 563 distinct mental health issues? That's a lot, eh? And then what's really kind of clouding the picture too is you might have like 5 or 6 at a time. You might have 10 at a time. You may have diagnoses that are really, really difficult. Bipolar disorder in this country, and we're not far behind Canada, we're not far behind Australia, and we're not far behind the States. From the prodromal, the primary emergence of symptoms, which usually occurs between the ages of 18 to 22, that's a safe bet, until a person gets a clear, firm diagnosis of a type of bipolar disorder. So from the time of first symptoms to the time where they actually have a diagnosis, a cocktail of drugs that will work for them, and a therapeutic pathway is 13 years. 13 years, because it mimics lots of different other things. So I think when we talk about mental health, what I'd like to actually talk about is not necessarily does so-and-so have a mental health problem, but the idea that actually, you know, we're all having a normal reaction to an abnormal event. That is precisely what is happening here. There's no more, no less. Okay? One of the things this has done in retail, I think, from my perspective, and it's been a positive, and I know it's weird to find positives in things like COVID, where people die and people get very sick, and people have lost jobs and things like that. But I think one of the positive things is it's reminded everybody in the retail industry of the courage with which they've always been able to address customers, to support customers, to help each other, to batten down the hatches. And I think that that's something that as we come out of this period, you'll find yourself probably with a whole new set of skills and a lot closer relationships with your colleagues. I often get asked, is stress a mental health problem? So does anybody want to raise their hands and say stress is a mental health problem? Yes. Nice. Perfect. Excellent. Nobody did? No, that's great. Stress is not a mental health problem, okay? And the HSE, you know, many years later, and we still use this, stress is not an illness, it is a state. However, if it becomes too excessive and prolonged, mental health issues may develop, or physical health issues may develop. So I'm going to give you the difference between stress and pressure. Stress is when you have to do something. So your boss has asked you, your partner, your mother, your friend, or yourself, you have to do something. And there's actual consequences to not doing it. Now, these consequences can be tiny, or they can be life-changing. But the recipe is, you have to do something. There are consequences to not doing it. It doesn't matter what the consequences are, how big or small. And you're lacking a key ingredient with which to be able to do it. So you lack the knowledge, the experience, the expertise, the people, the resource, the money, the time. Pressure, on the other hand, is a little bit different. And I think it's a helpful way to think about stress versus pressure, because we have now started to really kind of equate the word stress with pretty much anything under the sun. But pressure is different. Pressure is when you need to do something, your husband, your wife, your kids, your boss, whoever, asks you to do something, you have to do it. There are consequences to not doing it, small, medium, or huge. But you have absolutely every single thing you need in order to be able to execute what you need to do. So you've got the time, you've got the resource, you've got the people, you've got the expertise, you've got the knowledge. And even if you don't have it within, you know where to get it. Pressure is designed to make us perform. And stress is when the demands really outstrip our perceived ability. Now here's a trick. My mother is 83. And I have never heard my mother use the word stress in her life, ever. Never, ever, ever once in my 50 plus years on this planet have I ever heard her use. She says excited. So, hey, Mom, how was your day today? Oh, it was incredibly exciting. I had to go to 4 stores to get this. They were all out of that. She doesn't use the word stress because stress for her is a meaningless word. I want you to think about a time when you've been really stressed and think about, and maybe this is for later, think about what were the 3 main emotions I felt when I was feeling that stress? Yeah? So I'll share one with you from a recent situation that I had with a friend. And I got really kind of upset and something had happened. And I then checked myself and I went, just a minute, I'm not feeling stressed. This is not stress. This is feeling uncared about, taken advantage of, and sad. The point is, when we use stress willy-nilly, and we just say, oh, work stresses me, or this stresses me, or my husband stresses me, dig deeper. Do yourself that favor. Dig a little bit deeper, because when you tell yourself you're stressed, you're actually not really telling yourself anything. And that's not necessarily helpful in the short or the long run. Now, talking about how do we support people to thrive at work, well, one of the things we can do is when somebody says, I'm really stressed, and it's in the work context, to say, tell me more about that. Tell me, how are you feeling? That's a game changer. That's a real game changer, because we're actually asking them to consider themselves with the value they deserve. When we say, I'm stressed, it is meaningless, it does us nothing, but holds us in a bind. When we say, I'm sad, I'm exhausted, I'm unhappy, I'm low, I'm lonely, I'm missing my grandmother, etc., then we attach meaning to a word. And when you attach meaning to the word has less power. So let's have a look at a pretty interesting piece of work that was done by 2 psychologists, Yerkes and Dodson. And I see a couple of people nodding. This is a pretty cool model. It's used for all sorts of different things. Yerkes and Dodson developed this, and this was really a really important first moment in the time of academia where people were saying, what's the connection between work and illness? So what is the impact of a stressful environment in the workplace on emotional, mental, and physical well-being? And this was done in 1908. 1908. And people are always surprised about that. It's like we've invented stress. We haven't. You get on a mine 6, 7 days a week when you're a 13, 14-year-old kid. That's stressful. Yeah? You work in service in a house, which my great-grandmother did from the age of 12. And she was in service and had 1 day off a year and didn't see her parents for that whole year, and she was 12. Now, I'm not saying that they had it worse than we do. I'm not saying that. It's all relative. It's all relative. But what we do need to recognize is that if stress has been around since the dawn of time, it's going to be with us forever. So how do we actually manage that? If you think about stress as a coin, think about it as a coin. On one side, we have burnout. And there's lots and lots of talk about burnout right now. And that's kind of what we said earlier about, are we heading towards a place where we might become unwell because we've been going and going and going like the Titanic survivors did for so many hours? We've been doing it for 2 years, okay? So burnout we're really acquainted with, but bored out isn't something we may necessarily be aware of what that is. And both are actually very bad for your health. So if we look in the green zone, what that's saying is there's too little stress, so we're underloaded. I refer to it as bored out. And you can see that the performance absolutely is nil. You are not doing anything. You're not moving forward. I mean, maybe it's just me. I've had moments, not in RetailTrust, obviously, but I've had moments in my life where I've been so bored that the phone rings, I'm too bored to answer it, you know? Just there's no impetus. So what are we likely to do when we're bored? And I don't mean for a day. I mean sometimes for months, sometimes for years. We're more likely to drink alcohol. We're more likely to maybe take recreational drugs. We're more likely to eat foods that aren't healthy for us. We're more likely to become low in our mood. Not depressed. There's a big difference between low mood and depression, okay? But low mood, the ennui, the experience that all human beings have at some point. And then when somebody is calling you to do something, you can't even begin to understand how you can get the energy up. You're in a fog. Your motivation plummets. You're inert. And if that goes on for long enough, we're going to have problems. And those problems might be gastrointestinal problems. We might have liver problems. We might have higher risk of heart attack because of a sedentary lifestyle. And what we're eating, we could also develop depression and or anxiety, as just an example of 2 of the 563 that were mentioned earlier. Now, if we look on the red side, this is much more sort of we're acquainted with. And I find it really interesting. We never talk about burnout, you know? Like we live in a society where we're rewarded for like being the busiest people on the planet, right? Like it's a badge of honor. I don't know whether you know this, but one of the biggest physical health issues right now being reported in the NHS due to overuse of Zoom and Teams during the working day. Anybody use Zoom or Teams on, want to raise your hands for me? Yeah, right. Holy smokes, this is incredible. Serious health challenge for people are urinary tract infections. What is that about? We're locked to this computer, we're not hydrating, we're not drinking enough, and then when the call of nature requests that we join it, we don't. We put it off. Just another half an hour, just another hour, just another 2 hours. I think there's something that has to be said for a life well lived, and a life lived in a way where we don't bow at the altar of being the most stressed out. My father died at 49. I was 18 when he died, and I had a call his last night. My mom rang and she said, you must come down. And I did. And I said, Dad, I got a long way, hoping for a long life. I'm 18, just turned 18. I'm really hoping for some good advice from you, please. I got a long way to go without you. He gave me 2 pieces of advice. He said, number 1, never date a man who drives a motorcycle. I think it's because he was worried. But then after, like a month after he died, I met a guy who drove a motorcycle, so that didn't work out. But the second bit of advice I have never forgotten. And he said, Andrea, you are 18, you have your life ahead of you. Make good choices. Because I'll tell you what, and this is 2 hours before he died, because the graveyards are full of indispensable people. Let that sink in for a minute. Let that sink in. We're in a society where to be super stressed is a good thing? That's astonishing. Living a life of balance is preferable? Yeah, absolutely, of course it is. We've got major urinary tract infections going on. This is horrific. Not to mention the curve that we're starting to see of type 2 diabetes. If you guys haven't been checked in the last 2 years for type 2 diabetes, do get yourself checked, please. So we have the two sides of the same coin, essentially. And I think the reality is that, you know, optimum stress, or what I call optimum pressure, is when we're buzzing. You know, life is great. It's all good. Everything's fine. It's ticking along. We're busy. It's hectic, but we're managing. We're learning to say no. I came up on the train this morning. I swear to God, if you were there, like, if you have a problem saying no, hang out with a 2-year-old for a bit. This kid was like, no, 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 all the way from Houston. So listen to children when they say no, because kids know how to set boundaries. Why aren't we setting boundaries? We have to do this because COVID is going to go away one day, but the lessons we have learned cannot. The graveyards are full of indispensable people. Do we want to continue living a life like this? Absolutely not. So this is why we need to say, guys, anybody on my team or my colleagues or friends or my family, reminding people gently, take your time off. The world's going to survive without you. But unfortunately, self-care does, A, take practice, but also it takes a real commitment. So we talked a little bit about the difference between a mental health problem and a life event. And I think one of the biggest things that I want you guys to get out of this session today is don't Google, for the love of God, do not Google mental health, okay? Because you'll have 15 issues at once and it's going to just be wrong. Get professional support. Signpost your people to professional support. I'm going to talk to you in a little bit just about what RetailTrust does specifically. And again, as I mentioned, my colleague Neil Duffy is here and can answer any questions. Whatever type of support you have is absolutely critical at this time, okay? So it could be an employee assistance program. It could be a local counselor that you know. It could be the GP, okay? But the support has to be there. One of the things I think that has happened is we have a society where people kind of will bring us their problems and expect us to fix it. Okay, life is short. Don't do that. Because after 5 quasi-accidental counselor sessions, they'll stroll out of the room feeling great. You'll be going like, clutching a bottle of gin in the corner, weeping silently, saying, make this stop. Don't get into that trap in the first place. Connective conversations are not about fixing people. That's not about it. Kindness at Hive this week, this is a big thing. This is really important. We talk a lot about kindness, right? But one of the things I really want us to focus on is that connected conversations are kindness and compassion. Kindness and compassion. And I'll tell you what, kindness and compassion are not rocket science. They're rocket fuel. They're rocket fuel. Having a connected conversation requires us to be present. And it requires us to accept that what that person is telling us may not be something we want to hear. We may have certain judgments about the decisions that they're making in their life. We may think, oh my God, again? Again, you're still in that relationship? What are you doing? What are you doing? The point is, at the beginning of that supportive conversation, and we're talking in the workplace, okay? All right? The rule of thumb is basically don't give mental health or health advice to anybody unless 2 conditions apply. A, you've given birth to that person, or B, you had a pretty seismic role to play in the process. If they ain't your kid, you're not going to fix. Part of the connected conversations is also about encouraging people to feel empowered about taking charge. Psychodynamic theory relies on the idea that we all know what we really need to do deep down, right? We may not want to hear it. And that's okay. Sometimes we can be deaf to a message for many, many, many years, and then finally hear it when we're ready, okay? One thing I would also suggest is when you're signposting, whether that's to the GP or might be RetailTrust, for example, or it could be the NHS website, to be able to say to that person, if they push back, right? If they push back and they go, no, but I really want you. Can you help me? Can you be my counselor? Can you be my tax advisor? Can you be my legal aid? Can you come to divorce court with me? Can you fix my whatever? Then the line here is very clear. I don't want to deprive you of the opportunity for safe, confidential, and professional support. Connected conversations are actually not that difficult. When you go home and you write a list and you say, when was the last time I had a really connected conversation? And it may surprise you. Some of the most connected conversations you will ever have had in your life is on a train, on a plane, walking down the street, in a restaurant, waiting for your date to come. The most connected conversations are with strangers because we can be vulnerable. and that person can be vulnerable to us. Vulnerability is not a bad thing. Overreaching your boundaries and trying to fix them doesn't work. Being vulnerable and being in that moment is absolutely necessary. So maybe today you go home and you kind of think, what are maybe a few things that I can recall from having a really supportive conversation where that person didn't try and fix me? They didn't tell me what to do. They didn't give me advice. They didn't tell me what they thought. And worst of all, they didn't actually share their own story. Does that drive you crazy? It drives me up a wall. You know, somebody's saying, my grandmother died and I'm very upset, and the other person's like, oh my God, that happened to me, but mine was much worse. And it was horrific. And it was the worst possible bereavement you could. Sharing is comparing. To have a compassionate conversation means it comes from the heart. It comes from a place of your true humanity, being absolutely clear that I can do the best that I can do, and I'm not an expert, and I may mess this up, but you know what? Holy smokes, if I can do this with compassion and respect and kindness and honesty, that's what you've done. The supportive conversation in the workplace is an interesting one. I use the lighthouse analogy. So think of a lighthouse, and it's kind of standing above the ocean. So it's got a nice long view. It's got a really nice long lookout. It picks up distress. It's not in the ocean with that distress. It's not drowning with that distress. It's not being pulled down. But actually, it's standing tall and stable and firm and reaching that point and saying, I see you. I see you. And now the light is shared with you towards the signposting. That is all that you can do. And I think sometimes people think supportive conversations, it's like rocket science. It's no. Supportive conversations are rocket fuel. Taking care of yourself is super important. Super important. Really, really, really important. Thanks. Okay, it's like that old plane analogy, okay? So what we suggest, and this is really useful for retail because we know that we're going to come up against customers who might be quite difficult to deal with. They might distress us, or we might be in a bad place, or something else, it's chaos. Retail is like the NHS, man. It's busy and it's stressful. Is to first debrief. Not might mean picking up the phone to RetailTrust and saying, hey, I've just had a really difficult conversation. I've had a tough day. Or it might be calling your mom or your friends or your partner. A is for action. So immediately after that difficult conversation at work with a customer, a colleague, or whoever, you take literally 5 minutes. Take action. Get away from where you were physically. So we're going to break that chain of proximity, and we're going to leave that what we call proximal value. So we're no longer in the place where this difficult stuff happened, and we're going to get a cup of tea. We're going to watch puppy and kitten videos on TikTok. We're going to do something that has absolutely nothing to do with work and allows us to actually just calm down. That will actually get your adrenaline and cortisol levels down, okay? R is for recover. Get back out there. I know, it's hard, but you're going to recover. You're going to re-engage, and you're going to recover. You're going to say, okay, I've dealt with that. I can deal with the fallout later if I need to, but right now, I'm back on the floor, I'm back in the office, I'm back on the Teams call, I'm back. And then finally, E is for engage. And what I mean by engage is engage with yourself. At the end of every day, whether you're working or not, engage with yourself. Do something for you. A nice warm bath. It could be listening to some music. It could be playing with your dog or your cat, or hanging out with the kids, or making a nice meal. The DARE model works because one of the pivotal things it does for us psychologically is actually removes us in action. It removes us from the eye of the storm. And there is a saying, there's a great saying, it's a Yiddish saying, which is, you cannot heal from a burn by staying in the fire. It doesn't work. We try. We do this all the time. And then we're like, oh, I'm wondering why I'm burning. You got to get out of the fire. So even 5 minutes is going to make a difference. So as I said at the top of at the top of this today, RetailTrust was founded 190 years ago, January 1832. And it was really an organization, and remains an organization, that wanted to help people working in retail and associated industries to live their best life. And 190 years later, we are the charity for people in retail and associated industries. We can offer lots of different types of support, including, financial grants. It might be emotional support. It could be one-off. You just want to talk something out. Or it could be support after a critical incident, something like a robbery. Or it could be counseling. Or it could be couples counseling. Or it could be actually just being on our portal and seeing about 600 pieces of content, I think, now. It's huge. It's amazing. And people at RetailTrust are an absolute joy to work with, because not only are they hugely, hugely passionate about what they do, which is all about helping the beneficiary. We are a charity. We help the beneficiary. But also because I've seen them go through the highs and lows with you guys over the last 2 years. And they've been with you shoulder by shoulder. And they've been with you every step of the way. And we're all in this together. So, thank you.